So this is part 2 of a BBC I gave a few weeks ago, where I discussed one of my favorite books, which is the Atomic Energy Report, which was the first piece of information declassified from the Manhattan Project, written before testing was even done, written before the bombs were dropped in Japan. And so I look at this as a way to also look back at my own mind and see what were the things, what was going on in the people's mind who were developing these weapons, and how does that relate to my afflictions, my mental states that result in me engaging in negative actions? And how can I think about this in a general way to hopefully never do anything as terrible as make a nuclear weapon? So last time I focused on just motivation. And obviously that's something we talk about a lot. What is your motivation for the action? That is really the thing that can differentiate between something virtuous and non-virtuous. But unfortunately, I'm not always aware of my motivation. And sometimes it's a little unclear, or maybe I'm lying to myself about what my motivation actually is. And so I found that, at least personally, there are a few things that I can look for in my mind that indicate that something might be a bit amiss and that I need to step back and stop what I'm doing. And it's interesting to see the parallels in here. And so one of them is really just, in a way, arrogance, but losing track of the fact that I am an ordinary human being who has afflictions, who makes mistakes, who doesn't have all of the information. And if I engage in actions thinking that somehow that isn't true, that I am perfect, that I know everything that is going on, I really might end up hurting someone. And so this was something that really stood out to me from this book as well, in that it's talking about scientifically some of the things going on around radiation, and this was very early on. They didn't know a lot about safety and the health effects. And one of the passages talking about waste disposal has the amazing sentence, "As in all other matters of health, the tolerance standards that were set and met were so rigid as to leave not the slightest probability of danger to the health of the community or operating personnel." Now, I didn't go through the effort of looking up the peer-reviewed publications that would have come out in the subsequent decades, analyzing the diseases and risks and environmental impacts. There are other statements about, the impact to the environment. They tested it, it's fine, nothing to worry about. And they really just knew so little at this time. And it was new. In a way, it's not their fault. But one of the passages that really indicates how little they understood is later talking about instruments for radiation measurements. And they talked about these film badges, small pieces of film worn in the identification badge, the films being periodically developed and examined for radiation blackening. These instruments for individuals, such as the pocket meter and film badge, were extra and probably unnecessary precautions. Now so again, they developed this anew then. I have had maybe a dozen dosimeters in my life. Pretty much any time I have worked with radioactivity, I have had a film badge, perhaps a finger dosimeter when working in biomedical work. There's huge fields still now going on in research in biomedical physics to try to understand how to improve radiation measurements using this technique. So the fact that they did it, great, but they said, we probably don't need this. This is probably a moot point. And to see that when we're developing technology or really engaging in any sort of new activity, we don't know the extent of our own ignorance. And so in a way, that's where it's important to come back to motivation. If we don't know what we don't know, it's hard to really plan for that. Obviously, I don't want to fall to the side of being anxious about, I must know everything before I do anything. But to simply say, well, we've eliminated all danger whatsoever. These safety precautions are not necessary. And that's how people end up getting in terrible accidents that could have been prevented had they followed basic safety precautions or hurt others. So this for me is a big take-home message, that when I think about some of the times in which I have hurt others, it's because I thought I had more information than I did. So really recognizing my own limitations as an ordinary being is important to try to engage in virtue and not harm others. So another thing that I've noticed really helps me in my mind identify when I need to pause and really evaluate my actions is the question of responsibility. That when I see that I am not taking responsibility for my actions, that I think, well, I'm being forced to do this. I have no choice. That something's wrong, that I'm out of step with what my values are, and I actually do have choice. So if I don't feel comfortable taking responsibility for what I'm doing, I need to stop and look at what I'm doing and reevaluate, because I am responsible for my actions. And of course, there's that question of, for the impacts of creating the nuclear weapon, certainly the physicists were not the one who flew the plane over Japan and dropped the bomb. But are they responsible for the killing? And that's a big question, but it's interesting to see whether or not they thought they were responsible. And this is actually the last passage before the appendices, and it's a little bit long, but it's both beautiful in that it's expressing why this report was released, and also interesting to see kind of this refusal to take responsibility in a way. And that question of then, if you think that what's going on isn't necessarily right, how do you stop it? Because of the restrictions of military security, there has been no chance for the Congress or the people to debate such questions. They have been seriously considered by all concerned and vigorously debated among the scientists, and the conclusions reached have been passed along to the highest authorities. These questions are not technical questions, they are political and social questions, and the answers given to them may affect all mankind for generations. In thinking about them, the men on the project have been thinking as citizens of the United States vitally interested in the welfare of the human race. It has been their duty and that of the responsible high government officials who are informed to look beyond the limits of the present war and its weapons to the ultimate implications of these discoveries. This was a heavy responsibility. In a free country like ours, such questions should be debated by the people, and decisions must be made by the people through their representatives. And while that's very much true, the scientists knew that that was not happening at this time. So I find that interesting, that when we go through our actions and we maybe think, oh, I'm not the right person to be responsible for this, do we stop what we're doing? Do we get more information? Or do we just plow ahead and say, well, okay, I'll pass on my report to the authority and they'll sort it out later? So I find that really stark. And finally, if I've already perhaps gone a little bit too far and made some mistakes and started harming others, and maybe I receive feedback that I'm not really working with my mind, some afflictions are there, do I get defensive? If I'm getting defensive, that's a pretty good indication that something is wrong. If I know, like, oh yes, lunch is quite spicy today, and okay, I don't need to be defensive about that. There's a sign on it, it says spicy. But if I'm getting defensive, that shows something's wrong. And this is also a passage from the final chapter. Remember, this was a very boring book about who signed what paperwork, and it contains this passage. A weapon has been developed that is potentially destructive beyond the wildest nightmares of the imagination. A weapon so ideally suited to sudden, unannounced attack that a country's major cities might be destroyed overnight by an ostensibly friendly power. This weapon has not been created not by the devilish inspiration of some warped genius, but by the arduous labor of thousands of normal men and women working for the safety of their country. That sounds a little defensive to me. Before they knew that the weapon would really work, and while other passages indicate they are fairly sure it was going to be used, it hadn't been used yet. So may we watch our minds and catch ourselves when we are going down a dangerous path, perhaps one that we haven't gone down before, perhaps one that was not laid out clearly in the Vinaya or in the precepts, perhaps something the Buddha did not directly give a teaching on. But the Buddha taught us how to examine our mind, identify the afflictions, and know when we're about to harm others.